Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation. This is September 6th, 2013, and I have with me Denise Kiernan. We're in Oak Ridge. Denise, could you tell us your name and spell it?
My name is Denise, D-E-N-I-S-E, Kiernan, K-I-E-R-N-A-N.
Terrific. Denise, what got you interested in the subject of your wonderful new book, Girls Above the Atomic City?
My interest in Oak Ridge stemmed from this wonderful photograph taken by Ed Westcott, who was the official photographer of Oak Ridge during World War II. And it was this image of these young women sitting in front of these gigantic panels covered in all these knobs and dials. And at first I was just captivated by the image itself, but then I looked at the accompanying text, and it said something along the lines of, these young women, many of them recent high school graduates from rural Tennessee, are helping to enrich uranium for the world's first atomic bomb, only they didn't know that at the time. And that just got me completely hooked. And at first I thought, oh, I must be the only person who doesn't know about these thousands of people who lived in Tennessee and worked on the bomb. But I very quickly realized that while Los Alamos gets an extensive amount of attention and has over the years, because that's where the Fermis and the Oppenheimers and all of those folks were, that Oak Ridge's story really was not as well known. So I became very fascinated with the lives of these young women, and I wanted to know what the Manhattan Project looked like through their eyes. And so that was really the birth of the Girls of Atomic City, my book.
So now that you've sort of spent how long on this? Several years anyway.
Oh yeah, it's been in my life. It's been in my life about 7 years now. Yeah.
And gotten to know all about these women. What are some of your sort of major impressions of this time and of those people?
One of the most interesting things I found was that when I would approach, especially the women, and some of the men as well, and ask them to talk about their experiences, one of their first reactions was, oh, you don't want to talk to me, I don't know anything. You know, I don't know anything. Because of course the whole idea of Oak Ridge and Hanford and Los Alamos was you didn't know anything unless you were supposed to know something. So what they didn't realize was that they of course knew plenty, and that they had these incredible experiences that were very, very unique to this time and place in history. And of course once you get them talking, then you know they open up and you find out all kinds of fascinating things about the day-to-day life on the Manhattan Project, which I was interested in because I think that makes the story so accessible. And you know, there was this kind of common thread among folks about this sense of duty, because a lot of the questions I get when I talk about this book is, why would people leave their homes? Some of these people 18 years old. Why would they leave their homes and go to a city they're not being told the name of, to do a job that's not being explained to them? Why would anybody do that? Because I think in this day and age where we have access to information pretty much at the tip of our fingers, I think that's very hard for a lot of us to understand. And everybody said it was because it was the war. And it was interesting for me to really begin to understand what a tremendous impact World War II had on everyone's lives, not just the people who were away fighting, but everyone knew someone who was away fighting or was related to someone who was away fighting. And all the songs on the radio were about the war. All the movies in the theaters were about the war. You know, that was all you heard about. And there were rations of various foods and gasoline, and you know, you couldn't get tires for your cars and things of that nature. So everyone was aware pretty much 24 hours a day that there was this bigger event taking place and that it was affecting all of them, and that they felt this sense of wanting to do something to help, whether it was, you know, dance down at the USO or do a scrap metal drive or pick up and pack up and go to a city you've never heard the name of before to work on a project that's not being explained to you. So that was definitely a big impression while I was talking to people.
What about economic factors? We're just coming out of the Depression. How did that play into people's interest in working at at an unknown place?
The Depression was not a distant memory for many of these people. So one of the factors that affected whether or not they wanted to kind of pick up and move and go take a job was the fact that the pay was pretty good. For some people, it was more money than they had, ever seen before. One woman that I interviewed and I profile in The Girls of Atomic City, a woman named Helen, she was literally working at a diner in Tennessee and was approached by a man and recruited to come work on this project, that he wouldn't explain to her. And she was a little on the fence. And then she said he told her what she'd be making, which I think was like 78 cents an hour or something at the time. And she said, that was it. I quit and I got a bus ticket, and she was done. But she said she also felt good about doing that because she too had a brother who was away fighting. So when you took that, when you took World War II and how close that felt to everyone, and combined that with what were for many employees very good wages, it was a pretty compelling motivation to go pick up and go off into the land of mystery.
So, of the people you've talked to, most people came here and were pretty happy. Is that your impression?
The experience that individuals had when they came to Oak Ridge did vary. A lot of people, and I think this is testament to the fact that why Oak Ridge is, still here today. A lot of people really felt like they wanted to kind of dig in and make this place home. And a lot of people found it to be this terrific adventure. It was muddy and it was crazy, and there were people from all over the country living here, accents people hadn't heard before. But at the same time, it felt like a big adventure. Some of these women, especially the younger ones who were, 18, 19 years old, came from backgrounds where college wasn't really an option for them. So they were either going to stay in their town and get married and live out their life, on the farm they grew up on or in the town they grew up on. And here was this brand new place where they had their own job, their own dorm room, their own money. Lots of single men running around who'd been recruited. So in many ways, it felt like the colleges that they might have been able to go to had circumstances in their lives been different. So some of them really kind of embraced the pioneering way of life. For a lot of people, the shock was just too much. It was a very big difference. You get here, and there are gates, and there are guards, and there are badges, and you're not allowed to talk about what you're working on. And some people felt quite isolated. And so it did take a toll. It really kind of depended on the personality of the individual. And, fairly early on, there were meetings that indicated that they wanted to do something to help those folks that were having trouble adjusting. At one of these meetings, a woman brought up the fact that a lot of the young girls in the dorm were feeling, homesick, and this place was so strange and new, and we need something for them to do besides go to work and come back and just sit in their dorms and then go to work again in the next morning. And this was part of the impetus for what became quite an extensive recreational program in Oak Ridge. They wanted to have sports leagues and libraries and dances and trivia contests and all of those sorts of things so that people could actually do a little bit of relaxing and do a little bit of socializing while they were working on this, for some, very stressful project. I mean, Oak Ridge was running 24 hours a day. There were buses running 24 hours a day. There were shifts 24 hours a day. If you worked in some of the plants, you might be working, the graveyard shift, for a few days, and then working the morning shift, the following week. And it could be quite an adjustment for people. So they did two things. One was to start to create these recreational programs so that people could enjoy themselves in their time off, and ideally make some new friends since they were far from home. And they eventually, in 1944, brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Eric Clark, to be in the actual clinic in Townsite, in the original Townsite in Oak Ridge. And Dr. Clark was brought in to basically talk to anybody who wanted to talk to him, and just kind of, you know, see how they were feeling. I mean, some people, some scientists, you know, found it. He wrote in his papers, there's a wonderful collection of his papers at the National Archives in Atlanta. And, you know, he said some scientists found it, you know, very strange to, you know, be doing the exact same thing every day. And while they knew what they were doing, they did not know the larger purpose of what they were doing. And this sort of combination of stress and repetition, he said, was, you know, took a toll on some people. And so he found it, he wrote in his reports and wrote later on in his life after he left Oak Ridge that he found it to be just such a fascinating community from a psychiatric point of view to just study all of these people who had been brought in from so many different backgrounds and just kind of thrown together in this place behind a fence with all this mud and this secrecy. And he was really fascinated by the different reactions that people had. The people who really embraced it and said, this is fantastic and we're gonna, you know, make a go of it. And the people who thought, you know what, I can deal with this for now, but you know, as soon as the war is over, I'm gonna head home. And then the people who thought, I don't know if I can wait for the war to be over, I might just head home now. So Dr. Clark, I think he brought an awful lot to the community. I've interviewed people who met with him. Our lovely Bill Wilcox, who just passed. I gave a talk about the Girls of Atomic City, where Bill was in attendance, and I talked about Dr. Clark. And Bill was getting up to give a speech and actually receive an award after me, and he said, no one told me he was a psychiatrist. I just found out right now. He said, so it's taken me 70 years to figure out I'm nuts. So I think those I've interviewed. One of my ladies in the book was a nurse and knew Dr. Clark quite well. Bill met with Dr. Clark. Everybody had lovely things to say about him. I think he was a huge asset when they finally decided to bring him in. And I think he felt, as a psychiatrist, that it was a great experience for him just to be able to study this very unique population.
When you mentioned that some people decided, I just don't think I can make it through the war, were they allowed to leave?
Yes, I mean, you were allowed to leave if you didn't, you know, if it wasn't kind of floating your boat, but you were allowed to leave. I think people still found it difficult because of a variety of factors. One, we've talked about the fact that economically it was very good for most people to be here. It was a good job. And we're not that far away from the Depression. And a lot of people would have wanted to try and stick it out if possible, just because it was such good money, and that was important. Also, there was something called the certificate, I'm gonna forget the name. There was something, we were just doing renovations, so all I can think of is certificate of occupancy. You needed it's in the book. Do we have a copy of the book? You needed a certificate that verified that you were allowed, if you left a job that was considered to be vital to the war effort, you had to actually get a certification that allowed you to look for other work. Because what they did not want, and this was a national law, what they did not want was people job hopping. Because the more people moved around, the more difficult it was to maintain production rates. So if you left a job that was considered by the federal government to be important to the war effort, it could have been you were working in the post office, or it could have been you were working for the Manhattan Project. If you left that job or were fired from that job, you would not be able to get the certificate that would allow you to seek other work. So you would have to wait 3, possibly 6 months. And that was what they did to deter people from quitting their jobs and just leaving because they found something better somewhere else. So that was something that I think prevented a lot of people from leaving. It was also something that, you know, helped keep people in line, because if you were fired, you also could not get that certification that would allow you to go ahead and look for new jobs. And if you look at newspapers from the period when they advertised for jobs, it would say on those advertisements, certificates necessary. You had to be, you could not have been, jumping ship from another job and get picked up. They wanted that certification. So that both helped people stay where they were, and it also helped people, kind of stay in line, because if you got fired, you would be possibly out of work for, several months until that time period elapsed, and you'd be allowed to look for work again. So that was definitely a consideration for people who were thinking about leaving. But turnover was a big issue here. Turnover was a very big issue here, especially on construction, and it was a challenge for them to, in construction and in other areas, to keep people. And turnover was the one thing that they didn't want, because it did disrupt things.
What effect did all the secrecy have on the participants?
That varied too. When I talked to people, some people told me I was afraid, I'd say something wrong and, I'd get fired. And then I had other people I talked to say, it didn't really bother me. The one thing that does seem to be across the board was that when you first got here, it was took a little getting used to, all of the secrecy. But the thing was, secrecy was not something that was exclusive to the Manhattan Project. Loose lips sink ships was something that everybody heard during World War II. You were never supposed to talk about your kids' troop movements or what you were doing if you were working in a factory. It's just that was taken to a whole other level when you were working on the Manhattan Project. But the other thing was, it was so pervasive. There were billboards, and it was mentioned in your interviews, and there were, security guards, and people were checking passes, and there were, reminders in the movie theaters and pamphlets and everything you can think of, that after a while it just became part of the scenery. You'd walk past the same billboard every day that says, what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. After a while, you just don't think about it anymore. So I think at the beginning it was the most challenging for people. One woman I interviewed, she said, when she arrived, she said, I got through the gates and I saw all this stuff, and she thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to say something wrong and somebody's going to shoot me. If I had enough money, I'd go home. But she still lives here. So she lasted 70 years. So it didn't stick. But, she was a perfect example of, when she got here, it was quite a shock. But then she got into the dorm and made friends and ended up, just having a really great time. So it was a variety of reactions to the secrecy. And many people, especially, I think especially those who had, people away fighting, thought, if I'm not allowed to talk about it, I'm not allowed to talk about it. If that's the sacrifice I have to make, that's the sacrifice I have to make. Which I think is just difficult for us to understand today, because we just always want to know what's going on.
I think in your book you mentioned the problem that some spouses had. They're so used to knowing what's on the mind of their spouse, and then suddenly this whole realm of their life, their work, was off limits. Do you want to talk about that?
One of the more interesting aspects of the secrecy was the effect that it had on couples, especially married couples that were used to sharing things with each other. And in particular, Vi Warren, who was married to Stafford Warren. Stafford Warren was head of the entire medical section for the entire Manhattan Project. And his wife, Vi, was very intelligent, very educated, and they had a very close relationship, and she was used to sharing in all sorts of information. She was used to knowing what her husband was working on. And it was quite a difference for her when she came to Oak Ridge, and suddenly she was not allowed to know what was going on in her husband's life anymore. And she understood, but it was still quite a challenge. And She sort of dealt with it by writing a column for the newspaper, which is a wonderful column. And if you go back to the old Oak Ridgers, they're lovely to read. It's a very interesting look from the wives, the spouse point of view of life on Oak Ridge. And you just think about, a husband comes home from work or a wife comes home from work if they're both working, and you sit down at the dinner table and the conversation, well, honey, what did you do today? How was work today? And that's the one thing you actually can't talk about. So it really was a challenge for some couples to not be able to share in that daily experience anymore.
There's another element too that reminded me a little bit of the Stasi in East Germany during the post-war years, where you actually had coworkers spying on other coworkers on these envelopes that they were supposed to be sending. Do you want to talk about that a little?
In addition to the official security force, people who would get on the buses and make sure you had the appropriate badge and things of that nature, there were also a number of Oak Ridgers who were approached individually to listen in on conversations that were going on in their dorms, at work, in the cafeteria. One of the women that I interviewed, she was taken out of her dorm one evening by two men she'd never known before. They came and requested to see her and took her outside and said, would you mind, paying close attention to what everybody's saying around you at work and what they're saying, when you're in the cafeteria or you're out on the ball fields playing games, we're not supposed to talk about what's going on here. And if you hear somebody you think being a little too curious or asking too many questions, you can just fill out this form right here, say who the person was if you know their name and where the conversation took place and what was discussed. And you can put it in these little addressed envelopes. They were sent to, I think it was Acme Insurance in Knoxville, which is hilarious. And it'll be totally anonymous. There's a drop box at this particular location. No one will know it's you. So there was this completely different security force made up of 18-year-old girls, 35-year-old men, So every time you sat down and had a conversation with someone, you were, aware that somebody might be reporting back to someone else exactly what it was you were talking about.
A little unnerving.
I think it was rather unnerving for some people. I think other people, thought, okay, if somebody's listening to what I'm saying, I don't care. I know I'm not saying anything wrong. But some people, it made them very, very careful what they talked about and who they said it to. And, letters were censored as well. One of my ladies, Celia, she was requested by her mother to stop writing letters because the letters kept coming through with all these black bars over all the words because they were editing, they were censoring out different bits of information. And that really unnerved Celia because all she thought was, well, what did I say? Because she didn't think she'd said anything wrong. She thought, I don't know anything. What could I possibly be saying that's wrong? So it could be rather confusing as well.
So what were the demographics of Oak Ridge in terms of age and where people came from?
Oh, goodness. Because of the turnover, in some ways, it's hard to get really specific numbers on some of those things. There were more women than there were men. Most men were away fighting, so there were an awful lot of women here. The average age, I believe, was 27, so it was a pretty young town. It was a lot of young single people. There were blacks working here as well. There were black workers, and there were white workers. I believe there were also some Native American workers. I did not have the opportunity to speak to anyone of Native American descent. And I don't really have specifics on any other ethnic groups. But it was, Oak Ridge was segregated. Oak Ridge was completely segregated. The black families and black men and women, individual single men and women, lived in a separate area. There were hutments that they lived in. These were 16 by 16 small buildings that held 4 people, had a little stove in the middle of them. And if you were married, black husbands and wives were not allowed to live together. Some people thought they were going to be allowed to live together, did not find this out until they arrived in Oak Ridge. So the black men had their own hutman area, and the black women had their own hutman area, which was also surrounded by a barbed wire fence, which some of the women started calling the pen, some of the women I interviewed. There were security guards. There was limited visitation. So the women could go visit the men, but the men were not allowed to visit the women. And there was a curfew as well. And so if you were not back in your hut by, I think it was 10 o'clock, they would come around with the flashlights and, see who was where, and you'd get in trouble if you weren't where you were supposed to be. And one of the more heartbreaking aspects of this was that black husbands and wives were not allowed to bring their children to Oak Ridge either. So if you had children, they could not come. They had to stay behind. And one individual I interviewed, Katie Strickland, she and her husband had to leave their children behind in Alabama. She was fortunate she was able to leave them behind with her mother, but she and her husband came to Oak Ridge in any case because the amount of money they were able to make here I think it was, Katie said it was almost twice what she was making back home. So they decided to come and stick out the hardship, and they sent an awful lot of money home to her mother and to their children.
So by and large it was a good deal economically, which helped them override all these less fortunate aspects of it.
It was. When I talked to Katie, it's the economics was the final straw that had them move to Oak Ridge, because it was very difficult for her to leave her kids behind. But she knew there was no way they were going to make anywhere near that kind of money where they were living in Alabama. And and her husband came over first, and when he reported back that she could have work too, that's when they decided that they would just make it work. And then when the war was over, they would figure out what was going on. But the economics played a significant factor. And in many ways, Oak Ridge was a reflection, of the times in which the times and the region in which it was placed. I mean, this Tennessee in the 1940s. This was a very segregated time and place in our history, and it's unfortunate and sad, especially the fact that they weren't allowed to live together as husband and wife. And there are a number of letters that were written to bosses, to union leaders, to the President Roosevelt even, and you can find those in the archives, about people complaining that they did not know they were not going to be able to live with their spouses when they came to Oak Ridge. But the economics, yes, the economics did play a big role in what brought people to live under such difficult circumstances.
So it really probably wasn't until after the war that there was even an educational system at all for Afro-Americans.
That's right. That's right. And Katie and Willie were eventually able to bring their kids. I forget the specific year, but there was eventually a black elementary school. But the high school students were still having to be bused to the black high school in Knoxville, because Knoxville had segregated schools as well, because this is before Brown versus the Board of Ed. So, Knoxville schools were segregated as well. And then eventually the schooling in Oak Ridge expanded. But then once Brown versus Board of Ed came through, Oak Ridge was the first, I believe Oak Ridge was the first city in the state of Tennessee to desegregate their schools. Oak Ridge was the first. And Katie's daughter was the last valedictorian, or the valedictorian of the last class to graduate from the segregated Oak Ridge schools.
So interested in your answers. What was some of the most surprising things you learned in studying Oak Ridge?
There were things that just kind of floored me in a variety of ways as I researched Oak Ridge. There was this incredible amount of construction. I still remain stunned at the speed by which this place came into being. When you think about them moving folks off their land in late 1942, that was also surprising to me, the number of families that were displaced by Oak Ridge, and that some of those families some families had 2 weeks to kind of pack up and get out. And that was definitely surprising for me. I learned that there were some families that was the third time that they had to move. They had to move for the Great Smokies National Park, they had to move for the Norris Dam, and they had to move for Oak Ridge when it was constructed. And I just can't imagine having to go through that once, let alone 3 times. But that once they started building, basically from breaking ground in late 1942 to, spring of 1945, less than 3 years, they suddenly had 80,000 people living here, and closer to 100,000 people inside the gates when you took into consideration people who commuted here from nearby towns, and using more electricity than New York City, and buildings and cafeterias and buses around the clock and roller rinks and bowling leagues, and all of that happened in under 3 years, and that's on top of the plants that they built, and I found that stunning. There were some other things that were surprising about Oak Ridge in a more disturbing way. I came across the files related to plutonium research and research into the effect of plutonium on human beings. And there was a black construction worker who was coming into work at K25 one morning who got in a car accident. He and the guys in the car with him. There was a car accident about a mile away from K25, and he was taken to the hospital. And he had a broken leg among other injuries. And instead of being, having his leg set immediately, they injected him with plutonium without his consent, and they wanted to track that plutonium and see where it went through his body, which is why they did not set his leg immediately. And they would take urine and feces samples at certain intervals. They wanted to see whether or not it had penetrated his teeth, so they removed, I think it was 15 of his teeth to see if it had gone there. So that testing was something that I was really bowled over and shocked by. And a lot of this information just came out, became available in the 90s. And it's there was a commission on human radiation experiments under, I think it was during the Clinton administration, and they said, we want all these records out, and we want everybody to be able to look into them. And they interviewed a lot of the doctors who were a part of it, and released as many files and as many papers as they could. And it was that was quite shocking. That might be the most shocking thing that I came across when I was working on the book.
How do you feel that most people reacted to the news that they had been working on an atomic bomb?
What I found so interesting about the way people reacted to learning their role in the bombing of Hiroshima, because Oak Ridge supplied the fuel for the bomb that was detonated over Hiroshima, was, and I tried to portray this in The Girls of Atomic City, was that these people really had lived in two completely different worlds. They lived in a world with nuclear weapons, and they lived in a world without nuclear weapons. Now, I've never lived in that other world. I've known what the bomb, in quotes, is my entire life, and what that means, and that someone somewhere can push a button and something happens. You know, I remember that from when I was a kid. But these folks didn't. And so when the news first broke, you know, there was no television. You know, it was either you got a phone call, but very few people had phones in Oak Ridge. You heard in the newspaper, you heard by word of mouth. And pretty quickly, people heard there was this huge development having to do with the war, and that there was going to be an address from the president. And there had been some, you know, there had been a bombing, and there was going to be an address from the president. So everyone, you know, gathers around their radios, as you did, and listened to the president talk about this new bomb and this new weapon that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, and goes and, you know, harnessing the power of the atom, etc., and goes into all of this, not too much detail because everything was still pretty secret. And at the end toward the end of this address, actually mentions Oak Ridge by name. And people were already kind of processing the fact that there had been this bomb of a size that no one could even comprehend. And then they heard the name Oak Ridge, and then they were just floored, because they thought they'd gotten so used to just not knowing what was going on there. So not only did they know what they had been working on, but it turned out what they had been working on was apparently a part of something very, very big. And just how big it was really came in waves, in a sense. You know, early on, a lot of the images coming out of Japan were censored. So some of the images that are very familiar to those of us today, people didn't see for several months. And the devastation, I think, was hit more when I talked to people. The devastation hit them more when they saw some of the aftermath photos that had people in them, because the photos that initially came over were pretty much, you didn't see a lot of people in them. You saw buildings and things like that. It was a big mix of feelings, and you get people, I got people on all parts of the spectrum. I mean, people saying, you know, this is war. That's, you know, that's what you do in war. And then people saying, you know, I'm really sorry we had to do that, but I was really glad the war was over. And then other people who, you know, felt really upset that they had been a part of something that had taken, that had just caused so much devastation. So it was a very interesting mix of feelings that people had. And I think the one woman I interviewed, I think, put it very simply, but in a very kind of clear, poignant way. She said, I was so happy that the war was over and that my brother was going to come home. She said, but I was really, really sad because I like people and a lot of people died. And I thought that was very true. And it's a, you know, it's a very, very difficult moment, because if you see pictures of the end of World War II, you see, you know, sailors kissing girls in Times Square, and everybody's saying, you know, hooray. And people in Oak Ridge, you know, were happy that the war was over too. Everybody was happy that the war was over. But they had this added issue that they had been a part of something that was quite interesting and quite different and quite significant. And being a part of that, you know, was, you know, some people were, you know, proud that they'd made a contribution to, like everybody else, you were asked to do, you know, to help the government, to help the war effort, and that's what they did. And then people started to, you know, some people I talked to said they started to have concerns about, like, well, you know, am I okay? Is there, you know, what is this stuff called radiation? Because then there was this whole new language people had to get used to. You know, the phrase radiation sickness hadn't existed, you know, really in the common language, and now this was something people heard about. And And people were started eventually after a few months, they started hearing about, this strange cancer in Japan where the people had been bombed. That's what some of them referred to it as, this kind of, what is that? And then so much information came out really after August 6th. August 6th was just the beginning of understanding of what the bombing was. And then there was more information. But, a lot of people were very, very happy. People were very happy the war was over. But it was a very interesting moment for a lot of people, and continues to be, probably the most significant event of the 20th century for everyone. It affects our lives. It continues to affect our lives. It affects our economics. It affects our politics, the way we relate to other countries. Nuclear medicine has become a staple in every hospital in the world. So nuclear medicine, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, all of that, goes back to Oak Ridge. All of that goes back to 18-year-old girls sitting in front of panels, turning knobs and flipping switches. And it's quite an interesting history.
Indeed. You cover a lot of territory. Whoa. Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. So what was it like for children here? Do you have conversations with?
One of the women I profiled, Colleen, she was with a very big family and came over with her family. And the youngest of her siblings, I think, was around 4 or 5 and was going to nursery school. Colleen likes to joke that she would always mispronounce it, so she'd say Nazi school. But the trailer, they lived in Happy Valley, and some of the trailers that they would put up, because there was such a high demand for housing, they were running out of space, so they'd bring in these trailers and people would live with them. And Colleen's family's trailer was close to the fence, near the edge of the reservation, and one of her youngest siblings was convinced that the Germans were on the other side of the fence, so that she would stay away from the fence, because if you went to the fence, the Germans were on the other side of the fence. So I think the kids living here grew up very aware of the war and fences, and one side of the fence is good and the other side of the fence is bad, and the little ones had badges too, because everybody had to have their badges. But in other ways, it was quite normal. They walk past the security guards and go to school, and they wanted to make sure that the school system here was good, because they were bringing so many people from other parts of the country. They were bringing in scientists from all over, and people who were not going to let their children get a poor education. These were Nobel Prize winners who wanted their kids to get a good education. So the schools here became quite something, and they brought in teachers and resources from all over. So on the one hand, it was kind of normal, but if you were living in a trailer and thinking the Germans were on the other side of the fence, and you see guys with guns every day, it was a little different than some of them were used to, certainly. But it was unique. The one thing that I noticed when I talked to people is, even those people who left or and didn't continue to live in Oak Ridge after the war, or people who hated the food, or people who for whom it wasn't sort of the best of times, they all still talk about what a unique experience it was. And I think especially for those kids growing up around all that, it was particularly unique.
One of the things that Helen Jernigan talked about today was her work on both newsletter and that went to the workers, and recreation association, trying to provide essentially distractions.
Mm-hmm.
So how big a role were these recreation outlets for the young people from your studies here?
When I talk to people about what they remembered fondly, if you talk to people about what they didn't like, it was the mud and the food were the two most common answers. When I talk to people about what they had fond memories of, the dances was always number one. The dances, what started as sort of, maybe once a week, there were dances at the end, I think at least 3 times a week in different parts of the reservation. And and the sports leagues, and that there was just so much, and the theater, and that there was just so much to do. And I think it played a very important role. I think it allowed people to decompress a little. When you're living in a town that operates 24 hours a day and you're being told what you're doing is so important for the war, but we can't tell you what it is. We're all racing. It's a race against the clock, but we can't tell you when the deadline is. It's not your normal working situation. And no one was from here. Everyone, they might have been from near here, but this was a new place, and you were going to a new place where you might have known the people you arrived with, but besides that, you didn't know any of these other people. And I think the recreational activities not only let people blow off steam, but also help them make friends and help them, meet people that they might not meet at work. And you immediately sort of had to start talking about sort of who you were and where you were from, because if you met someone at the dance, you couldn't ask them what they did. People weren't even supposed to talk about which plant they worked in. I mean, if you worked at Y12, you never laid eyes on any other plants. You never got on any buses that went anywhere else. So the conversation was always about, where are you from? Do you have family? What songs do you like? All that sort of stuff. So I think living in a place that was contained and that was clearly so dedicated toward work and production and the war effort, I think having the recreational facilities, all those activities, allowed everybody to just feel a little more at ease and kind of enjoy what free time they had.
Is there something that I haven't asked that I should have that you think would be helpful in people?
Oh,
I
I know, it's one of those things. It's like your brain, you spend so much time. I mean, you spend so much time looking into this stuff, and you think there's so many things I could talk about. I always thought it was, I found it interesting that when the war was over, one of the big questions everybody had was, is Oak Ridge closing? Like, is that it? Are we pulling up tent stakes and heading out of town? And actually, a lot of people did start leaving. A lot of people said, war's over. I want to be home when my son gets home, want to be home when my brother gets home, when my boyfriend gets home, I'm getting out of here. But other people thought, if there's still going to be jobs here, I'm kind of getting used to this place, and all of those things that we talked about, all of those recreational activities and all of those, bonds that people formed. In many ways, it does kind of, remind me of, the bonds you form at college. You go away to school and you are all kind of in this new place together. And I think some very interesting bonds formed among these people. And so many of them were young and single that there were a lot of marriages and there started to be a lot of babies. And as strange and muddy and different as it was, Oak Ridge really started to feel like home for people. And especially those who knew, they were the first, not many of us can ever say, I mean, very few, I can't actually think of another town besides Oak Ridge off the top of my head, can say I was the first inhabitant of a town. I was here, I've been here as long as this town has been here. We're the original, pioneers of this place. So I think for a lot of people, it really started to feel like home. So once it became clear that the military was not going to just shut down in Oak Ridge and, I guess, tear the buildings down. I don't know what they thought they'd do with all those huge plants. For some people, that was, quite a relief because they'd actually, gotten used to it here and felt quite at home.
That's great.
Trying to think if there's anything else. Mm-hmm. I think I don't.
These are great. I
Okay.
think we covered everything that was on my list. I have to worry that we're supposed to be out of here at 5. I don't know how long it takes you to shut down, but I'm not leaving you much time.
Yeah. What do you think, Andy?
I mean, if you got more to say, I think we could probably.
Since we have 15.
Yeah. How much time we got left on, or how much time is?
Oh, we still got 29 minutes left.
Okay.
We do. Well, I mean, this could go on. I just don't really want to.
Yeah, I know.
Thinking, I know. I just looked at your book. I mean, it's a really wonderful book, but we want people to read it. Summarize the main plot.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, right. So that's not the point. And I think you've probably done a nice job on sort of summarizing these things. Can you is there any way you can reference the Chapel on the Hill? Talk about the Chapel on the Hill a little bit.
The Chapel on the Hill was an incredibly interesting place, I thought, because here you had all these people away from home, and one of the things that's important in people's lives is to be able to continue, following whatever religion they followed when they were back home. And at first, they had to kind of work with what they had. There would be services in the rec halls. There would be services in, the priest's home. They would make do however they could. And then they constructed the Chapel on the Hill. But of course, it wasn't as though there was just one denomination or one faith here that they had to, cater to. So the Chapel on the Hill pretty much served everybody. There were Baptists, there were Catholics, there were synagogues, there were Baptists, there were Catholics, there were Jewish services, the Episcopal, pretty much everything you can think of. And so, it was one of those situations where, the Catholics would come in, at one time and, then they'd finish up and, the crucifix would come down and maybe the Star of David goes up and then it's somebody else's turn. And I just thought that was such an interesting use of a religious facility that it really embraced out of need all of these different faiths in the exact same space. And of course, the Chapel on the Hill is still there and is still a functioning church. And I believe it's a Unitarian. I believe it's a Unitarian church. I might be mistaken, but yes, I found the Chapel on the Hill to be quite an interesting aspect of life in Oak Ridge.
And what about can you talk a little bit about Jackson Square and how that was an innovation for its time?
Jackson Square, in many ways, to my mind, was kind of like the first strip mall in the first gated community, if you think of Oak Ridge as a gated community. The town site, originally when they were planning Oak Ridge, they were planning for about 13,000 people, and that went out the window pretty quickly. But they wanted to keep the living area pretty compact, and that's what they originally referred to as town site. They wanted that to be where the dorms were and where the cafeteria was and where the little sundry store where you could, do a little bit of shopping and, a little grocer. They wanted all of that to be in the same place. So what ended up happening is there was this green, which was probably muddy some of the time because everything here was muddy. And there was a cafeteria and a rec hall and a movie theater and stores, and it was all in one little place, and which was quite unique in a country where Main Street was the norm. You would have quite a long, stretch in a town where you would, go down the street and all these different businesses would be there. but they kind of had it all in one spot because that was what they thought would best serve the town site community. And it was really the hub it was really the heart of Oak Ridge. And when major events took place, when VE Day, Jackson Square was the place to be. The end of the war, Jackson Square was the place to be. If there were big announcements, it was a natural place for people to congregate to, but in some ways quite ahead of its time.